This is The Listening Tube.
Hello, thank you for putting your ear to the listening tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. On this episode, I'll have a conversation with Emmy Award winner Amjad Tadros, who's been guiding foreign journalists around the Middle East for decades. But first,
Not the headlines.
allow me to share with you why context and punctuation are so important. The other night, I was on my way to bed when I met my wife in the hallway. She had gone to bed earlier but couldn't sleep and said she was going to go downstairs for a while. I went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, she wasn't in bed, which isn't unusual since she often gets up much earlier than I, but I had no idea if she ever even came back to bed. I was under the assumption that she didn't have to work that day. I did, so I got up and went through my morning routine, got dressed for work, and walked down the steps and into the living room where I expected to find her. She wasn't there. I looked outside and her car was gone. On the wall near our refrigerator is a chalkboard we use to write down things we need from the grocery store. On the chalkboard that morning were 3 words: left overnight. She had written those 3 words, obviously, before she left. I wondered where she might have gone in the middle of the night. Then I wondered if she planned on coming back. I should call her. So I did. She answered right away. I said, "Hey, darling, where are you?" She said, "I'm at work." I said, "Well, the chalkboard says you left overnight, and I was just wondering if you were coming back." She started to laugh. I was confused. "No," she said, "we're having leftovers tonight." "Well, that's not what it says. It says left overnight." For all I knew, she was on her way to Florida or the airport. It just goes to show how we can misinterpret communication if it's not done correctly or if it's taken out of context. I would have not been so confused if I knew she was scheduled to work that day. But I would still be wondering why she left in the middle of the night, based on how those 3 words were written on the chalkboard. Not in a line as if it were a sentence, but in a column with no punctuation. Her message could have been more clear if there were a hyphen between left and over. It could have also been modified by using the word it's prior to left, as in it's left overnight, or by adding an S at the end of over and to as a prefix for night, so it said leftovers tonight. There are at least a few ways that message could have been written differently. Although we both enjoyed telling the story to our friends and associates, I must admit that at first, I thought I was in the market for a new wife. So, does context matter? Absolutely. Does punctuation make your message more clear and understandable? You bet it does. Unfortunately, with today's text-first, call-second lifestyle and the need for instant response, punctuation is often neglected and words are replaced by acronyms with which the recipient may or may not be familiar. Bottom line is, if you want to mean what you say and say what you mean, there are ways to do that effectively. Now, you might be thinking, well, Bob, that's what you get for marrying some young trophy wife who writes like the kids do. In her defense, she did use whole words and not acronyms, and even though there was none, it wasn't necessarily the lack of punctuation that led to my confusion. What's important to remember is that what you think you're saying to somebody may not be what that person interprets it to be. Whether it's a simple text or a note on a chalkboard, Using complete words and punctuation will go a long way in reducing the possibility of being misunderstood. And if you have something important to say, you want it to be understood, don't you? If you're going to go out on a limb and make your own protest sign instead of using the pre-printed ones, you want to make sure your message is clear. If you're sending a text, you don't want the recipient to respond with, "What?" Make yourself clear the first time. It'll make life easier for everybody. If you're writing a letter, I guess you could use AI to help you, but I've seen some bad grammar come out of AI written material, so it's good to know the rules yourself. But if you have something to say, I want you to be not just heard, but understood. I want you to be clear in your guidance and instruction. And knowing how to write it down properly is a power accessible to anyone. Punctuation makes your words more powerful, more sincere, more accurate. It's easy to mean what you say, but being able to say what you mean is more important. And there are no good shortcuts when you want to make sure you are being understood, especially if you're saying it with your thumbs, or if you don't want your spouse to think you left them in the middle of the night.
Let's go back through the listening.
Sorry, booth announcer lady, we don't have time for that this week. I'm sure nothing happened anyway.
The listening tube will return at the speed of sound. Send email to thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
My guest today is a man whose experiences are like none other. For 30 years, Amjad Tadros has been showing the ropes to foreign journalists reporting from the Middle East. His experiences are now in a book called The Fixer, A Journalist's Accidental Journey Through the Middle East. Amjad spoke with me from his home in Amman, Jordan. Now, Mr. Tadros, when I look at what you've been doing for the past 30 plus years, it's not hard to recognize that you have been performing two very important roles in the world of journalism. One, as a journalist, and two, as a local guide for foreign correspondents in the Middle East. Which of those two things have you found to be the most challenging?
Well, I mean, my career kind of morphed from one into the other. So at the beginning, I was hired to be a fixer, and I didn't even know what a fixer means. So I just showed up at one day because I was just, desperate to get a job, and someone told me that there is a news organization at the hotel here in Amman, and they pay well, and they're just looking for people. So I showed up. I was 21 years old. I was, energetic. I could run. And they looked at me and they asked me, "Do you speak English?" I said, "I do speak English. In fact, I'm a graduate from British University. I have a degree in engineering." And they said, "Okay, you're hired for the next 2 days, and we'll see how that goes." So they hired me as a fixer, and I didn't even I had no idea what television business is all about. So they just sent me out to film with a crew, and I didn't even know what crew means or what. Anyway, so I just showed up and I worked we went out filming, and at that time, the first day of my job, I was sent to a refugee camp to film the refugees that they came out of Kuwait after Saddam's invasion in 1990. So, and then, I started to learn the ins and outs of the business. But basically, we were hired to be fixers, which means you can do anything. You have to make coffee, book airline tickets, find people to interview, look for story ideas, whatever it takes, to get the news on television. And so that was my career at the beginning. And then, with time, I started getting more and more involved in the business, and I started doing more editorial stuff, which became, so I became a journalist, so to speak. But, when I wrote the book, the book was called The Accidental Journalist. And because, my title at CBS News was, I was the Middle East producer. And at some point, I changed the name back to The Fixer. And my boss called me, my ex-boss called me, and he said, Amjad, why did you change the book, the name to The Fixer? I thought you didn't like to be called The Fixer because in the past, many of my colleagues thought the word fixer was a derogatory term. And they actually said, no, we are not fixers, we are producers. So in fact, at that time, CBS News issued a memo saying you have to call those people, producers, field producers. You should not calling them fixers. But at that time, I said, no, Andy, I'm happy to be called the fixer because I was the best fixer in the business, and it was never my intention to be a producer. I was happy to do what I was doing because I was very good at it. So why should be like just another producer? No, I was the fixer. So I called the book The Fixer, and this is where the name came from. And many of my friends now make fun of me. They call me the fixer, and I'm very happy to be called the fixer. So I was doing just two things. I was a fixer and a journalist. But I mean, at the end, I became, a journalist in a way. I did a lot of stories. I won 4 Emmys. A lot of people. I got a Peabody, and I did a lot of work. And now, I write. And at the end, I wrote a book as well. So you can call me both.
Now, the book, to make it official, it's called The Fixer, A Journalist's Accidental Journey Through the Middle East. And it is a chronicle of your experiences, correct?
Yes. I'm basically, what used to happen is that I used to go out, and do all these stories, travel, to Iraq, to the Gulf, to Yemen, to all these places that, and I've been through wars. I was injured. I was bombed in 1993. I got to meet Saddam Hussein in a hospital bed in a very funny story. And I met a lot of interesting people. And I used to go back home and I would just sit and, hold court. And my friends would say like, oh, tell us more. And then, I was a storyteller. I mean, sometimes people invite me to parties just because I'm a storyteller. And with time, a lot of my friends told me, you should not keep your stories to yourself. You should write them down. And I said, well, it's not easy to write them down, because in fact, in my past life, I failed my O-level English. I said, like, I can't even write. I said, we have to try. And then at some point, I thought, I have to do it. So I sat down, and at that time, there was one guy who was working with me called Andrew. And Andrew told me, I will help you. And Andrew is just, an American guy who showed up in the Middle East, and he was interested in the history of the Middle East and journalism. And we sat down in a cafe and we just wrote an outline of the book and I started filling it. And bit by bit, the book started to take shape and it was built. It was like building a puzzle, adding story here, story there, and we just arranged them together. And the book started to get shape. And then at some point, I got fed up because nobody wanted to publish it. Nobody was taking me seriously. So I abandoned the project for a few years. And then at some point, I said, okay, I have to come back and do it. And 3 years ago, I retired from CBS News, and I thought, now it's time to write the book. So I took back the old copies and we started rewriting again, and I got an editor, and we did the whole thing, and we put the book together, and I published it.
I have no doubt there are many wonderful and insightful stories to be told. Do you have a favorite?
Well, it's very difficult to pick a favorite story. In fact, the book is 130,000 words, which is a long book. Because usually books are about 100,000 words. And, some people said you have to cut it down. But for me, every story was so valuable. When I sat down to write it, one day my niece was looking over my shoulder and she said, Uncle, what are you doing? What is this book about? And she's 6 years old. And I said, it's about war. And I wanted to describe war to people. And my first line in the book is a line from an Arabic poetry from the Abbasid, from the Jahiliyyah period. And the line reads, war is only what you have known and tasted. No narrative can describe it well. And my main motivation was to describe to people what war is all about and how horrible it is. And and during my career, we lost a lot of my friends. A lot of my friends were killed, they're dead, because we went out to cover wars, and I thought it would be for everybody's good memory to document all these stories. And then later, now we hear all these, the collapse of the media in the United States and what's happening with CBS News. I'm sure you've heard about it. And all the accusations that have been leveled against us as being fake news and whatever. And I thought, it's my duty to document all the good work and the hard work we put in to try to tell the people what's really going on here in the Middle East. Like, we went to places like Yemen, we went to Iraq, we went to Egypt during the revolution, Libya, Syria, all these places. And, and we did a really good work, and we tried our best to tell the people what's going on. And we paid heavily for that, in terms of time, effort. People were injured and died. I was shot at 3 times, and personally, and we took it seriously, and we were not playing games. We were actually very serious journalists, and I thought it was a duty to write it down. Now, what is the favorite story? There are many. One of the best stories there is in the book, which could be a movie. It is one day, I was sent out to find this guy called Curveball, who was the Iraqi defector that told the Americans back in 2000, just before the Gulf War, that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. He has a factory. And this guy, in whose testimony Colin Powell went to the United Nations in 2003 and presented these photos of the so-called mobile trucks.
I remember
And,
that.
and on his testimony, the US went to war. It took me 4 years traveling to 7 countries to find him. Imagine. And so his story is known, but what is not known is how we found him. So the chapter, it's called Catching Curveball. It says how we caught him. And it is, it could be a spy novel because, on its own. Another favorite story in there, one day I showed up in Yemen, and by absolute mistake, I met this guy, and he turns out to be that he was Osama bin Laden's bodyguard. And I convinced him at the end to sit down and talk to us. And it was for the first time we actually talked to a terrorist, who is not shouting, because usually when you see terrorists on television, it's either they're carrying guns and shouting, and you don't know what they're talking about. And this guy, we sat with him, and he took us to his house and met his kids and family, and he told us his story, which is most riveting. Of course, we were accused by many that, we're putting, a human face to terrorism. Probably true. But at the same time, we explained to people why this guy ended up to be who he is. And this is basically this is what the book, it gives you the background. Why do wars start? What's happening here? What happened in Iraq before the war? And, there are very, very amazing, interesting stories about all the stories we did in Iraq before 2003 war, because in 2003, what people don't understand is that Saddam Hussein at that time did not want the war. Forget what you hear on television and all the public statements they made. They were terrified, and they tried their best to get out of the war. And in fact, they invited, CBS 60 Minutes at that time to do a lot of stories in Iraq. And basically, their intention was to show the world that they were not guilty as they were charged. And we did a lot of stories about spies and double agents and all the people who were telling them different stories. And one day they took us into the intelligence headquarters in Baghdad, one of the most horrible places in the world. And they presented us with this guy called Abdurrahman Yassin. And who's Abdurrahman Yassin? He is an Iraqi American who was accused by the FBI and the American government of being part of the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And by some stupid story, this guy ended up in Iraq, and he's wanted. He's still wanted on the FBI. I think there's $10 million prize on his head or something. And they said, okay, there he is, take him, give him back to the Americans. We don't want him. So there are a lot of all of these stories that that are in the book. And there are some nice stories. There are interesting stories about places like Qatar and Dubai, and why Dubai is what Dubai is, and why Qatar what they did. And there are stories about the revolution, the civil war in Syria, what happened there, what happened in Egypt. And there are 3 chapters about Yemen. And Yemen is one of my favorite countries. It's a very, very interesting place. It's thousands of years of history, very interesting people, and it is absolutely neglected and forgotten. And the people there have been, they got a really, really bad deal, and it's still happening till today. And people don't understand why Yemen is this way. And I tried to explain as much as I could I know I'm not. I was trying to give excuses or to be propagandist for anybody, but I was trying to do it just to tell people what I have seen and let them make up their mind. I'm not going to make opinions for people. I am, I am just a storyteller and just a witness. But I got a good opportunity of getting what we call the front row seat to history, and I thought it was my not duty, but it's good to let people know what happened.
Amjad, now obviously these stories have been compiled over a number of decades and they're available to us now, but in hindsight, do you wish that you had told any of these stories back then when they were topical and current?
Probably, but again, as I said in the book at the beginning, I was caught in the middle. I am Western educated. I understand the Western world. I know what the Americans mean when they say something. I can understand where it leads. I also, at the same time, am an Arab. I'm the son of, twice, two-time Palestinian refugees, and I know what's going on here. I know when Saddam Hussein gives a speech, what does he exactly mean? And the problem is that both parties talk over each other, they don't understand each other. And most of these wars could have been avoided if just somebody sat down and tried to listen and understand what the other person is doing. We did a lot of stories about the 9/11 hijackers, and we traveled the world. We went and met their families and we saw where they came from. And why would somebody like Muhammad Atta go to America and study to be a pilot and spend a year or a year and a half of his life to go in an airplane and kill himself? I mean, is he crazy? Seriously? Okay, and what made him do this? I'm not trying to be apologetic. What they did is absolutely terrible, and it's insane. But at the same time, there are root causes behind these actions. These people did not come from space and just went and killed themselves. If we look at where they came from, the reasons behind it, and if people understood what was going on, probably many of these incidents could have been avoided, and people's lives have been saved, and probably the world would have been a better place. But unfortunately, we always go back to the square one and of the same thing, and the scenarios in the Middle East keep repeating themselves. It's so sad. Like the Americans, when they came to Iraq in 2003, many of the soldiers came in with the best intentions. They thought they're going to bring freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people, and the Iraqi people, many of them were happy, they got rid of Saddam. Saddam was a horrible guy, by the way. He was a nice guy. And then suddenly, after few, and when the Americans came in, there were a lot of optimism. I've seen it myself firsthand. And many Iraqis thought that this is it for them. There'll be freedom, and the Americans are coming in and they're bringing Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And none of that happened. In fact, it just turned out to be a very, very big flop. And they took Iraq into a very bloody civil war that just many people died needlessly. American reputation has been tarnished, in a huge way. And they just left. And they left the country as it is. And, they're talking about nation building and democracy, and none of that happened. And now the same scenario is being, we hear it every day in the news now with Iran. Okay. And Iran, if you thought Iraq was a picnic, wait till you see what Iran is. Okay, because Iran is a country of 90 million people, is the size of France and Germany put together. It has thousands of years of history. Iranian people are very proud people. They don't like the regime, not all of them, uh, you know, but some do. Do you think that all the Iranians are against the regime? No. A lot of Iranians who actually believe in the propaganda of the regime. They believe in the so-called Wilayat al-Faqih. They believe that, the Murshid is an inspired person, and they're going to fight for it. And, some people think that, maybe 80% of the Iranian people are against the regime, but the 20% who are for the regime are going to fight with their teeth to the end. They knew what was going on, and they're not idiots. They are actually very pragmatic people. I'm not defending them by any stretch. I don't defend any regime based on religion. But at the same time, they, talk to them, don't, before, and, see what they're angry about and try to avoid this, because what we're seeing in Iran is just terrible. I can see Iraq happening again, but worse.
Well, from what I understand, from what I've been learning in the Western media, is that I believe that the United States is going to take an entirely different approach with Iran than they did with Iraq, and I hope that's the case.
I honestly hope I hope that they have a plan. I was one of the very few people in Iraq in before 2003 who actually thought that the Americans had a plan and they're going to come in and liberate the country and bring in democracy. I actually believed in this thing, and my friends, now tell me, see, you're an idiot, okay, because they showed up with no plan, you know, no plan whatsoever, and for a country that is just, and what happened, we got civil war. And Iran, I'm afraid, is going to be the same thing. I would love to hear the plan. How they are going to change the regime? How are you going to put a new regime that is, less bloody and less violent than this one? How are you going to bring in, I don't want to call it democracy, but stability to the country? Because look, every time, you change a regime, you get somebody worse. Russia, you had the revolution, whatever, when they got rid of Yeltsin. Who did you get up? Who did they get? Putin.
Putin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, yeah, yeah. Look what happened in Libya. They got rid of Gaddafi. Who would you get? A bunch of mini Gaddafis. Egypt. There was a revolution. At the end, the army took over took over power. You just cannot do this. This is not doable. I wish that they can do it. I'm not saying, I'm not for the Iranian regime by any stretch, but find us a way to change the country, make it, part of the civilized world, and let's move on. But what they are talking about, they want to bring the son of the Shah. This guy has been out of the country for 47 years. Nobody in Iran knows his name. Okay, and his father wasn't a nice guy either. And now they want to come put him in charge. I mean, come on.
Yeah,
You know,
I don't think the Iranian people want the son of the Shah or the son of the Shah back, and there is a parliament in exile called the Commission for the Resistance of Iran, and we'll see what happens there. But
I
but
mean, I wish all the luck. Seriously, I'm sitting in Amman now, and every couple of hours till today, just half an hour ago, we get sirens because the Iranians keep throwing missiles over our heads, trying to hit Israel. Okay, and we're just sitting like sitting ducks here, hoping that those missiles don't fall on our heads. And actually, some of them do fall here. 3 days ago, one missile fell like half a mile away from my house, and. We have nothing to do with this. And the Iranians lashed back, of course, because like now they accuse them of being, those people. They put them, their shoulders against their backs against the wall. They told them we're going to come and kill you all. And what do you expect them to do? Just sit there and wait? What they did, they lashed out at the Gulf countries, and most of those Gulf countries have nothing to do with this war. And what they did, they just went and bombed. Dubai. They bombed Abu Dhabi. They bombed the gas field of Qatar.
yep.
I mean, this gas field of Qatar, people don't know what it is. I have seen it myself. Actually, I was lucky enough to fly over it, the Ras Laffan, the gas field of Qatar. It's a wonder, one of the wonders of the world. The Qataris have built something that's absolutely unique. In the middle of the ocean, they built this gas field that's making them a lot of money, a lot of money. Okay, but the Qataris did not keep the money to themselves. Honestly, I mean, what they built, Qatar is one of the most, advanced countries in the world. They built hospitals, they built schools, they built universities, they built, you just saw the World Cup. What they have done, this is everything came from that gas field that the Iranians just bombed. We have to move forward in the Middle East. They are, they brought us back. They brought Qatar back 5 years. It will take them 5 years to get back to where they were. Okay, this is if the war stops tomorrow. And I wrote about these things for people to understand, about what this is all about. We Arabs, we are not hooligans, we are not murderers. We're just people. We have the same aspiration, the same hopes. We would like to be like the rest of the world. But instead, every 5 years, we get dragged into another war, and people just because simply nobody wants to understand who we are, and that's what I try to explain in my book.
Now, I would imagine being a journalist in that part of the world is as interesting and as complicated as you want it to be. What I'm interested in hearing from you is what is local reporting like where you live? Is it local government? Does it cover sports? A new place of worship being built? What makes local news where you live?
Well, I mean, the whole thing about what news is all about. I mean, local news is very important. People want to hear local news. They want to hear what the weather forecast. They want to hear the traffic situation. They want to hear what's happening in different parts of their country before even they start to understand international politics. So yes, in most Arab countries, we have news organization, but most of them are government sponsored or government run. And for many, many years, they have failed to provide people with answers to problems. So people, unfortunately, with time, stop trusting the local media. Nobody in Jordan watches the local television. Nobody. We don't even know how to tune to it, honestly speaking. And that opened the door for information coming out from abroad. Okay, so people start listening to foreign broadcasts, you know, at some point the Qataris, a few years ago, they filled the gap when they established Al Jazeera news channel. I don't know if you were aware of it. And Al Jazeera provided, fresh breath air for the Arab people because they started putting more news that talked about the problems and so on. And that created a little bit of a movement in the news business in the Arab world. So other channels tried to imitate it and so on, which was good. But at some point, again, everybody, start following the same, news and the same, the government, all the governments in the Arab world are, at the end of the day, are more powerful than the people. So they took over the media again. And then we got the social media and the Facebook involved. And the Facebook has been, has been very effective. The Egyptian revolution was caused by Facebook. It was called the Facebook Revolution. But again, after time, the governments realized what was going on. They built their own, armies, what's called electronic armies, to try to put their message and to take over the social media, and they were very successful. And now we have AI coming in, and again, I'm sure they have, because the governments have more money and more time than the ordinary people. So yes, and that creates a lot of problems. On top of that, now, and I always tell people, we Arabs, most of our history was written by foreigners. You get all the foreign correspondents showing up with their own ideas, their own biases, their own, I'm not saying they're biased, but, they come with their, their ideas, and they wrote about us. And I keep telling people, if we don't write our own history, somebody else is going to write it for us, and we're not going to like it. So I thought, for me to document these things as an Arab, as a local, to put in the local angle, the local breadth to the news would be better. So the more us Arabs, put these things online and put them out, we will get our point of view across. Because otherwise, other people are going to come and write it, and then we're going to like it. We're not going to like it. So, I'm not trying to be a saint or anything, but these are the facts of life. This is what's happening. And I think it is important for us to write the history. When I wrote my book, I was invited by a professor from Oxford University called Dr. Eugene Rogan. Eugene Rogan wrote a very, very interesting book called The Arabs, and talks about the history of the Arab world. And what he used when he wrote about the history of Damascus in the late 1800s, he used the notes from a barber in Damascus called Ali al-Buderi. And Ali al-Buderi used to go home every night after he closes his barber shop and write a memoir about what people were talking about in his barber shop. And Professor Rogan used Ali al-Buderi's notes to write the history of Damascus in that era. So when he met me, he said, "And who are you?" I said, "I am the barber. I did exactly what the barber did. I wrote the notes that I have seen.
Now,
And you, as a academic, you can take it and write a history book after, you know."
now you've done a lot of work with 60 Minutes and CBS News. So I'm guessing you've spent a lot of time escorting American journalists around the streets of places they had never seen before.
Totally.
Well, now you don't have to mention any names if you don't want to, but I just have to ask, what's the stupidest thing you've ever seen an American journalist do?
Well, I mean, with all due respect to the 60 Minutes correspondents, a lot of them are very professional and actually, know their way around. Like, I worked with Bob Simon, the late Bob Simon. I don't know if you remember him. I mean, Bob Simon, he was like my father. He taught me the ins and outs of television. And to be fair, he was, his depth of knowledge was just remarkable. But you get then sometimes you get the cowboys showing up, not from 60 Minutes, but usually from the news division, who have no idea what is going on. And I remember one time we took one famous correspondent to Damascus with a lady, and I don't want to mention her name. And in the morning, she came to me. She said, "Amjad, what do they mean by police state?" I said, like, it's police state when the government, basically spies on people and, checks on people and listen to their phone calls. And she said, "Oh, do you think they knew that we talked to that guy yesterday?" I said, that guy was the representative of Hamas that we spent 2 months trying to get permission to talk to him from the government. I said, of course they knew that we talked to that guy yesterday because, I mean, do you think in Syria during Assad's rule, we could step out of the hotel without them knowing what we were doing? And I mean, she had no idea. And then, and she said, and do they listen to our phone calls? I said, of course. She said, do you think they were listening to my phone call last night? I said, probably. And she said, oh, I was talking to my boyfriend. I said, oh, okay, I'm sure they got all the saucy details about that conversation. So, yes, you get that. But at the same time, no, you get people like, Bob Simon, Leslie Stoll, who is a very, very, very good correspondent, who is actually, I mean, I have the highest respect for her. And we have very good producers who actually, and they're very good people, by the way.
Have you ever played any jokes on any of the newbies who came there, or is there any sort of initiation rite?
Uh, yeah, but yes, I mean, so because what happened, especially in Iraq after the 2003 war, many journalists went there just to make names for themselves. Like, I reported from Iraq, and essentially what they were there for, they were for, a couple of days, and they left. They just want to put it on their CV. And one time I called my boss. I said, like, listen, this is not a vacation here. It's actually serious and it's dangerous. So stop sending people who don't know where they're going. And at least don't, and yes, but for 60 minutes, no. I mean, I have to, their correspondents, or at least the people I worked for at that time, the Mike Wallaces and the Ed Brady's of the world, were, very professional, and they listened, no, they actually listened to us. When they showed up, we would tell them, the story. And some of them, because, they do different stories all over the world. So, we give them a good brief and who these people are and what the story is all about. And they do understand, and they actually, come in with an open mind. Let's
I'm
say.
glad they took your advice. I'm sure you are too.
So yeah, most of them did. I mean, this is what they paid me for, to
Right.
to to do that for them.
As an American, I confess that we often make the mistake of assuming everyone else in the world is just like us. Is there one thing that you wish Americans would remember or perhaps forget about some misconception we may have about where you live in Jordan?
They have to, the thing in the Middle East, these are ancient societies. You know, Iraq. The history goes back, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. Egypt, 7,000 years. Iran, in 8,000 years. And those people have proud. The Arabs in general are proud people. If you come to an Arab and yell at him to take his wallet, or point a gun in his face and say, "Okay, just give me your wallet," he's going to probably fight you back and maybe die in the process. If you talk to him nicely, he will give you his wallet and his citizen's wallet. It's we are different. There are a lot of tradition. There is history. There is dignity. Uh, that some people don't. Americans usually show up and they think they can just buy their way in, and it doesn't work all the time. I mean, sometimes it does, but in most cases it doesn't. There is a lot of uh, new indignities that you have to deal with, and you have to drink a lot of teas before you start talking to people. You just can't just show up to somebody's house and start asking him for favors. You have to go there, sit there, and talk, drink 3 cups of tea, and talk about children, and and then start talking about whatever you're there for. And but sometimes a lot of Americans, unfortunately, they come in and they just think that this is business and transaction, and unfortunately, it doesn't work this way here. You need to understand the local uh, attributes, so to speak. There is one interesting thing. When I met Osama bin Laden's bodyguard, I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to him, and believe it or not, he loved Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I used to take him to Kentucky Fried Chicken in Sana'a, and we'd sit there, and he would tell me all sorts of things. And one of the things, that's it's all the stories in the book, is that we always think that terrorists are very, very efficient people. We think they are like the characters from 24, and they're not. They're actually just people who are chaotic. They have families. They have their wives calling them to asking them for things to do, or not to be late. They go to they take vacations sometimes, and sometimes they go to sleep, and one of the big incidents that happened in Yemen when the Al Qaeda decided to blow up the USS Cole in the port of Aden. They hired this guy and they put him on a boat with explosives, and his job was to go into the sea and bomb the ship in the international water before it gets into port. That was what he did. And guess what? The guy fell asleep. And when he woke up, the ship was already inside the port, and he blew it up there. And that created sorts of problems to Al Qaeda that they were not supposed to do, because the guy just fell asleep. I mean, he wasn't that efficient as we think, And so there are all these stories. I mean, about because these people at the end, they are terrorists, call them whatever you want, but they're humans at the end of the day. They have problems. They're like everybody else. And so, yes, so don't assume anything when you show up. It's, we're just people.
Thank you, Amjad Tadros, for sharing some behind-the-scenes stories with us in the Listening Tube. There are plenty more in The Fixer, a journalist's accidental journey through the Middle East. Learn more at amjadtadros.com/books. That's AMJADTADROS.com. Thanks again to Amjad for spending some time in the Listening Tube. The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2026. Shout out to some new places checking in: Vilnius, Lithuania, Teplice, Czech Republic, and Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. Follow the Listening Tube at thelisteningtube.com. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou Ad Infinitum.